Great, I'm going to talk about the state tree of Oregon. That's Dougas-fir, Pseudotsuga menziesii. The name Pseudotsuga means false hemlock. It used to be classified as a hemlock. It's also been classified as a spruce, a pine, a fir, but then eventually it got its own genus, and that's Pseudotsuga. The name Dougas-fir is usually capitalized because the name Douglas is for David Douglas, a Scottish botanist and explorer that was in Oregon back in early 1800s. And a lot of the trees he either named for other people or other people named them after him, and this is one of them, Dougas-fir. Dougas-fir is in the pine family. It has needle-like leaves in a spiral arrangement, but you can see that the needles stick out on all sides of the twig, sort of like a bottle brush. So they stick out underneath, they stick out a little bit on the top. When they're in really shaded, they can be somewhat too ranked, but not very much. That's one way to tell it apart from some of the other common needle-leaved conifers around here. They're green above, no bloom, but on the undersurface there's two bands of stomatal bloom. And they have a really strong, really nice scent. If you look at the ends of the branch, they have sharply pointed, reddish to mahogany colored buds that are covered with imbricate scales. So sort of like scales on a fish or roofing tiles on a roof. And they're sharply pointed, and there's usually one or several. They're not hard to find, these sharply pointed buds. It's a great characteristic for Dougas-fir. And even when the buds break, then these sort of reddish colored bud scales will fall to the ground, and then you still can identify it because of the orange to red colored bud scales everywhere. The other characteristic to see in the needles, make sure I get the right spot. I think this was the spot. It's hard to see, but there's a half-raised leaf scar where the needle attaches to the twig. So you can feel it with your finger. It's a slight bump. It's not prickly like a spruce. It's more just a little bump that the needle's attached to. And it's really not that different than hemlock. When you look at the leaf scar and compare it to a hemlock leaf scar, very similar, and you can see why they would be considered the same. The other thing that's similar to hemlock is that the needle is petiolate. It's got a tiny, tiny little stem, and so do hemlocks. So another characteristic that's shared here. Okay. The other distinctive thing about Dougas-fir are its cones. So these are kind of wet, unfortunately. The scales are back here. They're usually a tan color before they get soaked, and they have a smooth, rounded edge. But what's distinctive is this bract that sticks out longer than the scales. So the cone bracts are long, and they have 3 points, 2 wider points, and then a narrower one in the center. Some people say it looks like the back end of a rodent, say a squirrel or a chipmunk or a rat, and other people say it looks sort of like the face of an elephant with 2 ears and a trunk. But it's a distinctive characteristic. It's actually a characteristic for the whole genus Pseudotsuga, not just Pseudotsuga menziesii. And the length of the cone varies, but it's usually a couple inches to 3 inches in length, cylindrical, and they hang downward. And they're usually sticky with resin, especially earlier in the season. The bark starts out smooth and has resin blisters in it, and then over time you can see it becomes dark brown and increasingly furrowed, deeper furrows that will develop along the trunk. It's thick. It's a fire-resistant, thick-barked tree. If you see a cross-section of Dougas-fir and you see the bark, it sort of has a reddish color with cream bands in it, almost like it's a slab of bacon. Can be one way to recognize it. There are distinct subspecies within this species. It's found all over the Northwest, Pseudotsuga menziesii. But the different subspecies have different growth characteristics. West of the Cascade Crest, we have Pseudotsuga menziesii, which is also called Pacific Dougas-fir, and it's a huge, fast-growing tree. It can reach heights of 200 plus feet and become very large in diameter, 5-6 feet over enough time, and they live for hundreds of years. They are relatively shade intolerant compared to the trees that grow with them, like western hemlock, western red cedar, and because of that, they tend to do well where there's been a stand replacing disturbance. That might be a catastrophic fire or a large logging operation, but they need that sun to get started. And then once they grow up into the canopy, if their seeds fall to the ground, they don't really do that well under their own shade. And so these more shade-tolerant species gradually replace them. But because they're so long-lived, often there's another disturbance before it actually gets replaced in the upper canopy. Compare that to the Rocky Mountain subspecies of Douglas-fir. It's a smaller tree, slower growing, has more bloom on the needles, almost a bluish color to the needles. And relative to the trees that grow with it, it is shade tolerant. So you often find it growing with ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, these other species that need a lot of sun, and the Rocky Mountain Douglas-fir can grow under the shade of a ponderosa pine. It can't grow under its own shade, it's too dense, but it can grow under those pines. And so in that ecosystem, on the drier east side mountain ecosystems, it's a late successional species, while on the west side it's an early successional pioneer species. So entirely different ecological niche, simply because differences in their growth habit, but also the trees that are growing with them. Wherever it grows, but especially the Pacific Douglas-fir, it's incredibly important for lumber production. It's used for all kinds of things, plywood and lumber and finished lumber, and it's used for all kinds of products. Douglas-fir is the #1 softwood lumber producing species in the United States. And like I said, it's the #1 tree here in Oregon as well, and also our state tree. If you see a Douglas-fir in Oregon or any conifer tree and you say you're not sure if it's what kind of conifer it is, if you say it's a Douglas-fir, you're right, something like 8 out of 10 times, just because there's so much more of it than other species. I think that's all there is to say about Douglas-fir.